I'm Drew Davis.
I'm Matthew Robinson.
And you're listening to Theo Talks.
Drew, you and I sit every day in the same office, but for the sake of our listeners, why don't you introduce yourself and say a little bit about what you do at the Protestant faculty here in Bonn?
Yeah, well, I'm working in the section for New Testament with Professor Günther Röser, and so basically I'm researching on the New Testament Gospels and teaching in basic classes in the New Testament. So, I know what you do, but why don't you tell us as well a little bit about your position?
Yeah, I'm also a research associate, I think is the official translation they've given to us for wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter, but with Professor Hauschild in practical theology. And my research is more situated in systematic theology, and that is with Professor Cornelia Richter. So I sit kind of between these two disciplines. So what is a wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter? Maybe we can get to some of the system or the uniqueness of the system of theology in Germany.
That's a good question. As you kind of already alluded to, it's a little difficult to translate. No one outside of Germany, I think, maybe in some other German countries, or German-speaking countries perhaps, but I think most people outside the German system don't even really know what to do with our position, because I think in the German system we're seen sort of still as, we haven't yet arrived, so to speak. We're not yet professors in the German sense. Whereas maybe in other countries we might already be qualified for a professorship or something. But it's actually a good deal because we get the chance to, we don't have to teach very many classes, and so that allows us at the same time to work on projects that will make us qualified for the next step, whether here or outside of Germany. That's the way I view it anyway. Mm-hmm. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I would say it's probably the closest comparison in the English-speaking context, at least, is a postdoc position.
Yeah.
With a major difference being that this position as a research associate can last 3-6 years or possibly even longer, depending on the situation, whereas a typical postdoc in theology in the U.S. or in Great Britain would typically last 1 to 3 years, maybe, I'm guessing. Mm-hmm. Or at least based on what I know from talking with colleagues. But I take it one of the things that might be of interest for someone listening to this podcast is trying to either learn about the German system, or if they're already in the German system, to compare and contrast some similarities and differences from the perspective of people like us who have some experience in both systems and who've had to go through a few years now of acclimating to the German system from the American system. So I don't know, maybe you could start off just by summarizing from the beginning of studies, what are some of the similarities and differences as you've seen it?
Yeah, good question. I can tell from, a little bit of background from my perspective. I did my doctorate here in Germany, so though I had already started a PhD program in the States and ended up in Germany, I sort of got to live some of the phase before getting to where we are now, and so I think that gives me a slightly different perspective from your situation, which actually is also pretty interesting. But
I mean, you studied business as an undergraduate, right?
Oh, yeah, okay.
Which German theologians studied business as an undergraduate?
Yeah, none. None. Thank you for getting me to where I needed to go there. So I was able to study, I kind of did like a traditional American course of studies. I studied something other than theology, did my bachelor's, and then decided, I think I'll study theology now, and then did basically a 2.5-year master's focusing on New Testament, though I had to do all the different areas of theology with that. And so then I was able to go into a PhD program in the States, no problem. Got a master's degree in theology, did my graduate record exam, and that's good. So when I came to Germany, it was a little bit more tricky because I was trying to do a doctorate in a system that required that I have had studied theology for at least 6 years by itself. And so whereas other PhD students, or really not PhD, but other doctoral students that I was with, they didn't have a master's degree, but they had studied, basically 3 times as long as I had on theology. And so it was kind of an interesting deal because in some ways when I arrived to do my doctorate, I noticed that, okay, I may have a little more experience in research and dealing with secondary literature, but I noticed that the others were much more adept at working very carefully with in my case, the biblical texts. You could tell that there was a much, I wouldn't want to say necessarily bigger emphasis, but I think the way that the system was built required a lot more detailed knowledge of the text, for example. And that was one thing I noticed very quickly. But in order to get to that point in the first place, I did have to take Latin, for example, which wouldn't have been required otherwise for a similar program in the States. And so I had to take Latin here, which was a challenge. And I also had to do some other leveling work to sort of get up to snuff with the others, which fortunately in my case wasn't too much. I was lucky to have a supervisor who really wanted to make sure that I, A, got in the program, and B, finished all of the prerequisites that I still had to fulfill, but that, so that gave me a good support in order to be able to get through it, because it took me about a year to take care of all of that before I could really focus in on the dissertation. So those are, for me, the things that were a bit of hurdles, but it worked out okay in my case. So. Yeah. But what about for you? So you had already done your PhD in the States, so what did you see as far as differences coming over?
Yeah, the differences I'm still learning. Seems every semester there's some new aspect of the examination system or the module system here that I still don't understand or that I've just figured out. But, I mean, the main ones you've already mentioned. So I think this could be of interest for students here in theology in Germany, or students maybe thinking about coming over for further study. So the study of theology in Germany is a 5 to 6 year process as a sort of undergraduate, what we would say in the U.S. undergraduate. And that is roughly equivalent to a bachelor's and a master's degree by the time that they finish. And the study of theology requires, as you indicated also, that they pass state exams in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, which not only do you not have to study theology as an undergraduate in order to do graduate study in theology in the UK or in the US, for example, but if you do not study theology as an undergraduate and then start as a graduate, you don't even need to start doing all those languages. You might, if your area of emphasis is, for example, in church history or naturally in exegesis, but if you do a doctorate in contextual theologies, for example, which is something that I work more on, so let's say Pentecostalism in East Africa, it might be much more relevant to your work that you study Kiswahili than Latin. And so that's an interesting difference that I've observed here. But I happened to kind of get lucky, if you will, in transferring into the system because I had studied philosophy and classics as an undergraduate, and so for that I did Latin and Greek anyways as part of the study. And then I did a seminary degree in Chicago, and that enabled me to do Hebrew there. And that was 3 years of theological courses and so on, which, as you said, kind of helped me get up to speed. And then after that, did a second master's degree in religious studies, which enabled me to take further courses in theology. And then, so I kind of accidentally checked off all the boxes, if you will, which then made the pivot into the German system a little less difficult. I didn't have to, for example, take the Latin test here in Germany because I was able to bring those over. But, you know, for other students that we have here in Bonn who are studying, for example, in our Masters of Ecumenical Studies program, if they want to move on from this program into doctoral work, they have to finish those languages.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting challenge. And then, as you also indicated, there's a difference between the Doctor of Philosophy, the PhD, and the Doctor Theo, the Doctor of Theology. Are there other differences besides language that... Say, I don't even know.
I'm not sure. It's hard.
Ignorance.
I think it's such a different system. It's hard to compare them exactly. I mean, the main thing, and I think the most obvious difference is that the presuppositions are different. Of being, like I mentioned, or like we both mentioned a second ago, you've had a 6-year course of theology studies, but there's the fact that it's the only thing you have to do really is write the dissertation, and then you usually have to have an oral examination at the end. It's usually it's not a dissertation defense, but rather exams in, depending on where you study, 3 or all 5 of the theological disciplines. So in that way, the structure is a little bit backwards from an American perspective, not in the polemical sense of backwards, but literally flipped around, because usually you would have comprehensive exams before you're even allowed to do your dissertation, and that those all follow up on a whole set of coursework that's designed to prepare you to write a dissertation and get you used to doing research. But now I think I've anticipated what I was going to ask you, and that is, what was it like for you coming? Well, maybe it's a slightly different question actually, but what did you have? What sort of issues did you face coming to the system having already had a PhD? Did that have any effect on the transfer?
Actually, no. I would say, if anything, it's easiest to transfer into the system once you already have your doctorate, because if you're trying to make the transition from the English language context into the German language context, I think it might be easiest once you've already gotten all of those qualifications checked off. And here, so also transitioning a little bit now to a different topic, but one of the things I've loved about working here for the last 3.5 years is the freedom for research that I've had.
Yeah.
Both in terms of content and in terms of the administrative support. So as you said, I teach 2 classes a semester, as you do, and my position at first was a 3-year position, so I didn't have to worry every year about reapplying for new funding. And those 2 classes per semester, usually one has been sort of handed to me, like, okay, we need you to teach this, which, is great. I can't complain or object to that. But I've been able to then pick my other topics. And even in the cases where something was handed to me, sometimes it was just sort of a module, like, okay, we need a course in intercultural theology, and we need you to take care of that this semester. Well, then I could still pick the topic. And that really has integrated very nicely with my own research program, the kind of writing I've wanted to work on, or, developed an excursion project with the students to go to Ethiopia. That was, there was just the readiness and the willingness to adapt the system to allow that kind of creativity. To speak in stereotypes, German, society is maybe stereotyped as being very, very bureaucratic, and I guess to an extent that's true, and depends on, if you're at the immigration office, then yes, absolutely. Yeah. But, and even here in the university context, that's true, but on the personal level, though, people are always, in my limited experience so far, very willing to, within those kind of, stiff structures, to be very creative in them, and to be open to new proposals, new ideas. So all of that is a long way of saying I found the transition to be really, for me, not just seamless, more or less, but also very freedom-giving for working on the things I want to work on. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah,
I have to agree with that, especially, we already gave you one example for me, but also whenever I got the job here, I wasn't even in Germany yet. And so, I had been in Germany, but I was back at home in Texas, and we came across issues of, well, how can I get this job? I hadn't quite finished the doctorate yet, and it was a question of whether or not I had really reached all of the full. Whereas in one university had agreed that I was qualified to be basically a candidate for a doctorate, Bonn had not yet made that decision, and so it wasn't yet clear, since I hadn't finished the Dr. Theo, if I was really had the qualifications of a theology student to take on this job, because as it's also the PhD or the doctorate students that can work in our position as wissenschaftliche Mitarbeiter. So, but where I wanted to go with that is that my boss, it was the same thing. He tried to do what he could to figure out, okay, how do we solve this problem? How do we prove basically that this guy's qualified to do this? Mm-hmm. And it took some time. It was a lot of emails back and forth with a lot of attachments, but ended up being successful. So once you knew, you kind of, like you said, the people, or my experience too has been people will go to bat to help you out.
Okay.
But all that kind of raised a question for me, and that is how, my background I already talked about, but how did you get to Germany in the first place? Because you'd already had some experience here before you came to Bonn.
Let me try to answer that question on a couple of different levels. The first was just research-based. So when I did my PhD in the US, the topic was the sort of social theory in relation to ecclesiology of Friedrich Schleiermacher in his sort of early Romantic phase. So it was a very Germany-oriented dissertation. And for that, first my doctoral advisor had said to me that if you want to work on that, but then you absolutely have to learn German. She said that was non-negotiable, and it had to be really excellent too. Now, I don't make any claims for myself in that regard, but I'm just saying what she said. And so she said I had to go do a language program in Germany, and I did that in 2010 in Munich for 2 months, I think it was. And then 2011 came back for 4 months on a pre-dissertation scholarship to do some initial dissertation research to try to solidify what my topic was going to be, and that was in Berlin at the Theological faculty there. And at that time I met Wilhelm Grebe, who was a practical theologian in Berlin, and he invited me to come back for a year to do a year of dissertation research, and I did that in 2012, 2013. So that's kind of how I made those first connections. During that year, then I visited a number of conferences and symposia and so on, and you know me from being in the office together. I have a lot of strong opinions about everything, even though I don't really know what I'm talking about. But was always, meeting people and asking questions and writing someone an email and so on. And then when I finished the PhD, I thought, man, it would be really great if we could move back to Germany to do a postdoc, because this is the second level on which I'd like to answer the question. The kind of way of doing systematic theology here, and also the situation of theology in the university as a scientific discipline, or as an academic discipline, is somewhat unique. My wife says I cannot say somewhat unique, because the thing is either unique or it's not, but there you go. I think it's unique here. And it's not, on the one hand, it is confessional in the sense that we're in a Protestant faculty and we also have a Catholic faculty here. So in the Protestant faculty, we do Protestant theology in some sense or another, although maybe I would ask you next if you do Protestant exegesis.
Yeah, good question.
But on the other hand, it is a kind of research into, it's a textual, historical, empirical, and philosophical research into phenomena or expressions of Christian religion, and questions about certain types of faith questions are bracketed for the sake of being able to study and describe the appearances of those Christian expressions in the world. And so we kind of bracket the kind of questions of ultimacy sometimes for the sake of trying to adequately or fairly interact with the phenomena as they express themselves. And I feel like that's a little bit different than at least what I had been exposed to in the U.S., where often the situation is either a religious studies department, where questions of Christian faith are sort of, to an extent themselves, well, if not suspect, then at least not at the top of the list.
Yeah.
Or a seminary context, where there's going to be a lot that's already assumed as being true.
Yeah.
And, a lot of orthodoxies that are just accepted, where I would want to really kind of dig underneath them and see, okay, where are the roots there? Where did that come from? And somehow theology in Germany and in my field, which is a kind of intersection of practical, systematic, and religious studies, both of those things coexist in some kind of harmony. Not always. It's not a utopia, of course, but yeah, I feel like I can have conversations with religious studies colleagues here and be clear that I'm a theologian, and that's somehow not seen as that I've already been uncritical with the assumptions that I make about truth or about reality or something. And on the other hand, I can sit with someone who is a self-described theologian, and I don't have to worry about being too critical. Or I shouldn't go there because that question's not allowed.
Yeah.
So that's how I came here and the reason that I'm doing theology here. What distinguishes exegesis in the German context? An illustrious history and heritage, and then, to what extent is that still felt today? Why do you like working in your field in this situation?
That's a good set of questions. I have to say, even when I was studying theology for the first time in seminary, or learning exegesis for the first time more specifically, you notice in reading it that there's a lot of German names quoted or cited. And so it always kind of had a sort of mystique for me, and I always had the interest in studying in Germany, perhaps in part for that reason. And I think that I've noticed, similar to you, that I think my perception actually from those days when I first started was that, especially since I was studying in a seminary context, that the German approaches that I was familiar with seemed very, I probably wouldn't have called it scientific at the time, because I wasn't used to, in the States, or in English anyway, calling theology scientific doesn't sound quite right, since science is more of the natural sciences.
Yeah.
But it certainly seemed very exacting, or almost as if all theological questions would be bracketed out, like you mentioned, or something like that. But getting here, I think one of the interesting things for me was that I think I've sort of seen that the exacting nature of the exegesis, or maybe you could call it philology, really, is still there and plays a huge role. But what surprised me was how often exegetical articles would have some sort of theological component to them. And that's one thing that I found somewhat a strange tension, because when I was getting into the whole PhD thing, or research, life of doing research in the States, it was more in a seminary context, more confessional context, but I had a feeling what I was really doing was biblical studies and not really theology. But when I got to Germany and I tried to do biblical studies, the questions started arising, well, what theological, what does this serve? How does this serve us theologically? And I'll never forget, one of the evaluations of my dissertation sort of even postulated whether my biblical studies background in the States had something to do with why I had not drawn any theological conclusions about my thesis. And so I thought, wow, that's interesting. Wouldn't have even thought about that.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that still fascinates me a little bit.
Yeah.
Not that, even though I think the basic exegesis that I see people doing basically would, bracket out the maybe theological concern or something, but you still have to see that the questions that are raised often have some sort of theological background to them. I think that sort of just belongs to the whole thing, being in a theological faculty, that our interests are sort of driven by initial theological questions at some point. Mm-hmm. So I think that's always there. But one thing that I do value is how much, maybe it only appears that way, but I think it's nice, for example, that the people that teach the languages here, for example, are often philologists, classical philologists, and so you kind of at least get the feeling. I don't know if it always is that way in practice, that what you're doing is shared with other people who are doing similar exegesis of ancient texts. Mm-hmm. Whether they would see that or not is maybe a question. I did have a course once with a Egyptologist on the Gospel of Thomas, and he was very skeptical of what the theologians, quote unquote, were always doing. But in those discussions, it was often less about theological questions than about the questions being posed of the text that he didn't really like. And they weren't theological questions, but they had to do with how does this text, Gospel of Thomas, relate to biblical texts. And I think that he saw as sort of, not so helpful in that particular case. But so in some ways, Germany has surprised me in some ways with the theological interest, and then also kind of gone against the grain, because my tendency would have been to think, it's just purely scientific. Wasn't that? And it turns out where I was doing it more, what I thought of as purely scientific, was more in a context where it was much more confessional. So sort of a thing that I found fascinating.
Can you now sort of concretize that a little bit in the case of your current project? You're doing work on the Synoptics, and I pick your brain a little bit about it from time to time, and it sounds like, to me, as a non-exegete, a super interesting way of trying to access religious attitudes and understandings in first century Greco-Roman antiquity, religious understandings of Christians then, self-understandings, by using the sort of use of the Old Testament and the New Testament. But now I'm going to just hand it over to you, because obviously you'll explain it much better, but I think it would also be a good illustration of what you were just talking about.
Yeah, that's true. I didn't think about that. It comes back to me now that you mention it. So basically what I'm working on is I'm working sort of in a classical set of problems, the synoptic problem and the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And in some ways, for me, that just has a simple, maybe exegetical, philological interest that I would like to know what relation they have to each other, even though it's a question that's, basically 2,000 years old now. But what that has to offer, an answer to those questions, which incidentally recently have been raised and sort of anew, and sort of the old consensus is started to break down, is that changes the way, if we know who used who, if Matthew used Mark or the other way around perhaps, for example, then that has a completely different effect on how you actually read the Bible. And not necessarily just as someone who sits down and reads the Bible, but even as a pastor or scholar trying to interpret, let's say, Mark. If Mark's the first gospel, then you read him in one way. And if he's reacting to Matthew, which probably most would reject, I think I would too, but if you turned it around, then you have to read Mark in a much different light. Mm-hmm. And so that's one area where I've felt quite a bit of freedom to look at old questions anew, but then also be able to have something to offer that's ends up having some sort of theological importance. And I think, for example, one of the best concrete examples of that is the new discussion is about whether Matthew and Luke, I say new, it's not completely new, but we'll just put it that way for now, I guess, is whether Matthew and Luke knew, or one of them knew the other, rather than being independent from one another. And that's a really interesting question in some sociological or early Christian sociological situations, because Luke is known to have taken a little more into account which role women play in early Christianity, or at least in his story, in comparison to Matthew. So, for example, in Matthew, it's Joseph who receives the visions about what the family is to do. But in Luke, at least in the case of Mary and Joseph, it's Mary who receives a vision. You have the women in Luke 8 who are serving in Jesus or helping Jesus' ministry, for example. And wouldn't that be interesting to think, well, hold on a second, what if Matthew knew Luke? That might be a little bit theologically disappointing, because that would mean that he changed everything right back around. Yeah. But if Luke knew Matthew, then you could propose that Luke is changing the story on purpose, that he wants to have something to say about why it's important that Mary receives the vision. And then you would have to go into what that might mean, or how that might actually have worked. Yeah. But those are sort of some areas I think sometimes actually get overlooked on the importance of figuring out these relationships, as passé as the whole question may seem to some.
The other, sorry to put you on the spot, but you also recently did this talk, I don't know if you're doing it in an article or not, but on genre and acts, which I thought was super interesting because of the theological significance that you were kind of excavating with regard to this. The theological significance of genre. And here we're not talking about. I pointed out because it might not be self-evident to sort of the non-exegete, the non-expert exegete, that in the way that you use characters and the language that they use, that they're doing theology with that. The way I think you were working on the phrase of the God-fearers, and the way that kind of was a keyword or code for certain affiliations, belongings to different communities, and kind of signaling inclusion or exclusion and so on. And those are very kind of sociological and maybe even ecclesiological types of questions, but that's work that you're doing as an exegete. And again, as another kind of example of the theological significance of exegesis without it being a kind of establishing orthodoxies or something like that in exegesis. So it's not that you're doing theology in the sense of, well, look, here's what the Bible tells us to say or think or do, but you're kind of excavating the theologies of the people who are either writing or in these stories or something like that. I don't know if you want to...
Yeah, so the question was, the conference that this had to do with was, what role does genre have to play with ethics in New Testament texts, or the ethics that the authors want to support? And that's very interesting, because the case that I was looking at, as you mentioned, was in Acts, and which can easily be taken as, well, more or less the best source we have for early Christian history. In fact, basically the only one for the development of early Christian communities. So, well, what happens then if you read those, maybe a few exemplary, or the stories of some exemplary characters, not as historical records on per se, but also as texts that are supposed to tell you about how you're supposed to live, which, if you think about Plutarch's Lives or something, would be a typical way of dealing with historical figures in antiquity, that their lives should tell you also something about your own life and how you're supposed to live that life. And so that raises some interesting questions and problems for exegetes and for theologians, perhaps. If you think about, well, if we exclude exegetes from theologians, which most Germans wouldn't want to do, but if you say, for example, with Cornelius the God-fearer, well, he's sort of seen as the first Gentile convert, or it's a little bit debated how you're supposed to read the text, but let's say he's the first Gentile convert, and he's characterized as a God-fearer. Well, normally people would say, okay, this is a guy that had some relation to the Jewish synagogue that's implied in the text already, and he's just made the rest of the way over into becoming a believer in Jesus. But if you look at that text really closely, you start to notice that it's really important to the author what kind of person he is, not just as someone who has some association with Judaism, but that he is pious, that he prays regularly, that he gives alms. And not only that he gives alms, but he gives alms to the Jewish people. He has a family that is also apparently religious or pious. And his those soldiers that he sends, or maybe it's not soldiers, I think it is soldiers though, that are his messengers to Peter, they're also pious. And so he's a guy who's got everything under control religiously. And so then you have to ask yourself, well, what does it mean to be a God-fearer? Is that really how we're supposed to understand this? And I won't go into the entire argument, but there's a good case to be made that he's not a God-fearer in the historical sense of a group of Gentiles who liked Jewish religion and took part in the synagogue to some greater or lesser degree, but rather that he is someone who fears God. And of course, for any Jewish writer, as most likely the author of Acts was, that means the Jewish God, of course, but it also tells you something about his ethics and how he lives, who he worships. Piety in that case would also have to be Jewish piety. And so when Peter, for example, can say, okay, now I see the God that all the people of all the nations are acceptable to God who fear him, then you have to read that as, okay, this could mean that other people that want to be a part of early Christianity need to have some sort of positive relationship to Judaism and the one God of Judaism, for example, and have to have a certain piety and a certain ethic. And so, I mean, obviously that tells us something about early Christian ethics and the way they thought about things. The way you would carry that over today, that's a whole other set of questions, but certainly that's a good example where you can see that how the exegesis is not just merely philological. It's going somewhere with it. Yeah. So our whole discussion has had something to do with maybe some characteristics about theology in Germany in some of the concrete ways that we looked at, in this case, the Bible. What would kind of bringing it full circle back to the Germany aspect of this whole business? What have you found to be most attractive for you in Germany, or what has it been that has kept you in Germany since you've been here?
Yeah, and my answer to that question will be largely non-theological, except maybe some sort of I could reflect back on it in a systematic theological ethics sense, but let's just bracket that. Really, like concrete things, actually. That here, I mean, the system of German theology has its own instabilities as far as career goes. That's definitely the case. But here, different than my adjunct situation in the U.S., where I was paid, about $3,500 per course, and so I could then I could still work 60 to 70 hours a week and end up making $20,000 for the whole year, gross.
Yeah.
And out of that, I have to pay all of my health insurance, and I have to pay for all the childcare, and I have to pay for this, that, and the other thing. It's just completely unsustainable and very fragile for a person at the beginning stages of their career. Here, it's not like, we're making bank or anything. That's definitely not the case. But we have health insurance. And my kids go to a very decent public school that we don't have to dish out thousands for. And it's still quite a good quality school. And similarly with after school care and things like that, it's affordable. When I go to the doctor, I don't have to pay $50 to $100 for a copay every time, and then on top of that, a few hundred for prescription drugs. So there's a lot of things like that that are very attractive to me. That kind of general consciousness about environmental ethics. Now, you kind of dig below the surface there. I think maybe there's a lot of work to be done in Germany, just as there is in the U.S. But at least, the society is sort of on board with that. Yeah. And it's not contested, is climate change real? It's kind of relaxing in an existential way to not have to, worry about if I'm going to have to debate somebody, whether it's okay to, or whether it's right to believe in climate change. Now, I don't want to present too romantic a view. Obviously, there are some very troubling features to the social landscape in Germany too. I mean, in the U.S., we have a very destructive and unwelcoming, I would say, discourse about whether and when migrants can come into the U.S. It's a very inhospitable kind of attitude, or at least there's this very inhospitable cloud over that whole discussion, that's not absent from the German scene. And even though Germany has done an astonishingly good job in welcoming, the numbers vary, but let's say 1 million to 1.5 million migrants and refugees over the past 5 years or so, and that really can't be sort of devalued. That has to be, I think, highlighted. And at the same time, there's some troubling developments, obviously, in places where the alternative for Germany is gaining strength and so on. So it's not a utopia at all, but there's a lot of those practical things that keep me here. And what about you?
Yeah, I think I would probably say much the same to you, as you about the practical aspects of life here. I would also say, well, I think after I studied here initially for a year, I thought, well, I've got to go back. I really enjoyed it, and I think I enjoyed the theological climate. For example, I found that it was a very, this touches a bit on what we've already talked about, but it was I found openness, that you could have a completely open mind to make an argument for whatever you thought was right. But there was also still, like we've talked about, undergirding theological concern about the whole thing. I've just liked the mix of that. And so that drew me back. I also liked I liked the thought of the challenge of coming back and trying to teach here, do something in a foreign country and foreign language. And then, of course, a lot of the practical aspects that you mentioned were also a draw. For example, when I saw the job posting for this and saw it was only 3 years, I thought, of course, it's been extended now a couple of times, so that's a testament to how that can go. But I'll never forget thinking at first, ooh, it's only 3 years, but then remembering, well, how many times since my wife and I were married, we had never stayed in one place longer than 3 years. So what did it matter? Might as well go. So, and I knew it could only get worse. I mean, at that point, I hadn't taught before, so I knew that an adjunct situation would not be ideal, and wouldn't be, like you said, sustainable. So 3 years anywhere, it sounded pretty good, and I'd wanted to come back anyway. But since then, we've sort of just gotten used to living here, and we're in a lucky situation where we can walk or ride our bikes to work or get around, and that's just really nice. I would find it. I really had enough of driving a car a lot. Of course, sometimes a car would be nice, but yeah, it's just for me. Really, it fits kind of the life I want to live here very well, and that's really nice. And in general, like I said, I've just found the culture at the university very fitting to, I guess, my own style, and I feel always challenged to keep moving forward. There's definitely always that, and I think that would be there anywhere. But in some ways, I've found people here that have supported me there, and it's just kind of been a draw. It's just much more. In some ways, it's a more stable outlook than where I was in the States at the time. But to that, I would also say that despite that, there's always kind of keep moving, keep pushing yourself. We've talked about it before, you and me in the office, like there's going to be weekends you just have to stay up all night or whatever. But one of the practical aspects I really like is that there's a really easy balance between life and work in Germany. And you get a lot of days off, and that's not even including vacation. You get more days, public holidays, than you get vacation time, sometimes in the States, depending. And so I just really like it that people, they're going to, at least in our line of work, they're going to push you, but they're going to know you need a break too, and they value that. Yeah. So all the things kind of work together to sort of have kept me here so far.
So I would say then maybe we can wrap up with forcing ourselves to name kind of one, let's say, area of growth for I don't know, in our areas of work here, and then I would close with a commercial for one of our programs, but for studying here in Bonn in particular.
Sounds good.
But I'll go first since I'm putting you on the spot again. And that is that the strength is, as I already said, I find my colleagues here to be extraordinarily open. I mean, very welcoming and willing to consider new ideas from any number of different angles and so on. And yet, for reasons I don't always understand, the system works in such a way that theology in Germany is not diverse. They are working on the gender diversity issue, and they have made a lot of progress in that area. But in terms of, confessional diversity is almost a non-starter because of the system, because we're in a Protestant faculty, and so it's very, very difficult. There are exceptions, but very, very difficult to incorporate Orthodox or Catholic students, or those Protestant students who are not really part of the regional church's system, which includes those of us from the outside. Not to mention any more kind of Pentecostal or global Christian perspectives.
Yeah.
Then that, right on the heels of that, I think Bonn is a fantastic place to try to be working on that, because we do have one of, I think, only two, I think maybe there's three now, English language master's programs in Germany, where international students can come and study once they have demonstrated adequate study elsewhere first. But so that's a real strength and a kind of testament to the interest of this university in particular in diversifying the theology. Yeah. But there's a lot of, I think, room for growth there.
Yeah, I would say something similar. I had to think about this a little bit, but from my perspective, theology in Germany, or maybe speaking more from the exegetical side, maybe not just, it can be a little bit insular. I think I have the impression that, for example, international in this case I'm really speaking more from biblical studies. So if I think about the big international biblical groups, there's not a lot of Germans that take place, like in the SBL, Society of Biblical Literature. I think the German conference scene, so to speak, is a little more receives a little more attention than more the international scene. That's maybe a little bit generalized, but that's my impression. Not to say that the scholars here don't, read all the other international publications, but I think there's a little bit less exchange between German exegetes and non-German exegetes than there could be. And that sort of takes me back to what I had said initially about one of the draws for me to Germany was sort of the golden age of German exegesis, like in the mid-20th century. They struck my interest in that time. There was a lot of Americans, for example, going to Germany to do their PhDs, but that's really not so much the case anymore. And I think that Germany, as we've sort of tried to show here, has a lot to offer. And I think it's just a little bit of a shame that I think that the balance of power, so to speak, has shifted towards the Anglo-Saxon realm, away from the German-speaking world, because I think people just don't get to see what's happening here that's quite positive. So I would say, things like the Master of Ecumenical Studies would be good opportunities for people to get a view of sort of how it's done, so to speak, in Germany, and see sort of what strengths it has and perhaps what weaknesses.
Yeah, cool. Well, it was nice to talk with you.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Since we never get to do that in the office.
Exactly, in our American bubble in the office.
Right.
All right.